in the quiet countryside of Cambodia, where rice paddies shimmer under the golden sun and the Sen River winds gently past small fishing villages, a boy was born who would one day shape and shatter the destiny of his nation. His name at birth was Saloth Sar, though history would remember him by a far more infamous name: Pol Pot. Born in either 1925 or 1928, depending on which records you believe, he came into the world in a position of privilege. His family was wealthy by local standards, owning more than 20 acres of fertile rice fields, a herd of cattle, and enjoying close ties to the Cambodian royal court. His heritage was a blend of Khmer roots and Chinese ancestry, placing him at a unique cultural crossroads. From the very beginning, young Saloth Sar's life was marked by comfort and opportunity. While many Cambodian children in the 1920s and 30s toiled in fields from sunrise to sunset, he walked a different path literally. He left his small village to study first at a Buddhist monastery, where he learned discipline and the teachings of the Buddha, and later at a French Catholic school, where he was introduced to Western-style education, though not an exceptional student by academic standards. His family's wealth and influence ensured doors were always open to him. The world around him, however, was anything but stable. French colonial rule was deeply entrenched in Cambodia, and the whispers of global change were beginning to echo even in the remote provinces. In the years of his youth, World War II would redraw the map of Southeast Asia. The Japanese occupation of Cambodia, the brief flicker of independence in 1945, and the eventual return of French control all planted seeds of political unrest, seeds that would later grow into something far darker. Pol Pot's journey from a privileged rural upbringing to the leader of one of the most radical revolutions in modern history is a story of contradictions. How does a boy born into comfort and tradition come to believe that the only way forward is through tearing his own society apart? How does a young man who once wore the saffron robes of a novice monk transform into the architect of a social experiment that would cost millions of lives? In this video, we will unravel the life of Pol Pot, not just the public figure who ruled Cambodia with an iron grip from 1975 to 1979, but also the man behind the ideology, the choices, and the devastating consequences. This is not just history, it is a cautionary tale about power, ideology, and the fragile line between vision and destruction. If you are passionate about learning the untold stories of history, about understanding the forces that shape nations and change lives, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. By joining our community, you will never miss an opportunity to explore the past, reflect on its lessons, and engage in meaningful conversations about the world we live in today. Your support helps us bring more in-depth, thought-provoking stories to light, stories that matter. From an early age, Saloth Sar's life was shaped by a curious blend of privilege, tradition, and opportunity. Born into a prosperous rural family in Cambodia, with both Khmer and Chinese roots, he enjoyed a comfort that few in his country could imagine at the time. His family's wealth allowed him to avoid the grinding poverty that marked the lives of so many others, and their social standing opened doors that would remain closed to most. Yet, despite this advantage, his early years did not mark him as an exceptional student. In fact, his academic performance was unremarkable, and those who knew him during his youth would have had little reason to suspect that he would one day become one of the most influential and controversial figures in Cambodia's modern history. His education began in the quiet, disciplined halls of a Buddhist monastery. These temples, with their ancient rhythms of chanting and study, were a place where boys of his background were often sent, both to gain moral grounding and to preserve the cultural and religious traditions of their ancestors. The life here was structured and meditative, centered on Buddhist teachings that encouraged humility, compassion, and self-discipline. He would rise before dawn, join the other novices in their morning routines, and spend his days in an atmosphere of quiet order. The Buddhist monastery offered more than just spiritual guidance, it was also a gateway to basic education. Teaching reading, writing, and elements of Cambodian history and culture. Later, his path took a sharp turn when he was enrolled in a French Catholic school, part of the colonial education system established by France, which at that time governed Cambodia as part of French Indochina. This new environment was a world away from the monastery. The focus here was on European history, literature, and the French language, taught by priests and lay teachers who brought with them the values and perspectives of the colonial world. Students were encouraged to think of themselves not just as Cambodians, but as subjects of a wider French cultural sphere. For many, this education promised the chance to enter government service or rise into the educated elite, a path that could lead to power and influence. Yet, while others excelled in this environment, Saloth Sar did not stand out academically. His grades were average at best, and he often struggled to keep up with the demands of his studies. This did not mean he lacked ambition, but his strengths lay elsewhere. In truth, his progress through the educational system was eased by the quiet but powerful influence of his family's connections. His relatives included members of the royal court and individuals with ties to high-ranking officials in the French colonial administration. These connections smoothed over academic shortcomings and ensured that opportunities remained open to him despite his lackluster performance. This early blend of influences the moral discipline of the monastery, the cosmopolitan reach of the French school, and the quiet assurance of privilege formed a complex foundation for the man he would become. The monastery had instilled in him an understanding of Cambodian tradition and the central role of religion in everyday life, while the French school exposed him to Western ideas and the colonial worldview. Yet, neither setting seemed to fully capture his loyalty or inspire him toward a clear path. Instead, these years planted seeds, a familiarity with both worlds, yet a deep sense of distance from each. He was not entirely at home in the spiritual, traditional life of the monks, nor did he fully embrace the values and aspirations of the French-educated elite. It is in these contrasts between tradition and modernity, privilege and personal struggle, cultural pride and foreign influence, that we can begin to see the early formation of his worldview. Though he did not yet possess a coherent ideology, the experiences of moving between these two very different educational environments gave him a perspective that few of his peers shared. He had seen the devotion and humility of the monks, and he had also witnessed the authority and self-confidence of the colonial administrators. Somewhere between these extremes, a quiet ambition began to grow, even if it was not yet fully formed or recognized by those around him. At the time, few could have predicted where this path would lead. To his classmates, he was simply another student, privileged but unremarkable, moving through life's stages with the help of a strong family network. Yet, history often reminds us that early brilliance is not the only path to influence, and that ambition can take root even in unlikely soil. Saloth Sar's journey was just beginning, and the contrasts of his youth rooted in both the spiritual and the secular, the Cambodian and the French, would one day play a crucial role in shaping the leader he would become. Before we dive deeper into the turning points that transformed this quiet young man into a figure whose actions would echo through the history of an entire nation, we invite you to join us in this journey through the past. If you find this exploration of history engaging and want to uncover more stories that shaped our world, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter. Your support helps us bring you more carefully researched, thought-provoking stories that shed light on the events and individuals who left a lasting mark on history. The world was already in turmoil when young Saloth Sar was growing up in Cambodia, and the ripple effects of global conflict would reach deep into the heart of his homeland. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, The French colonial presence in Indochina still appeared firm, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Then came the Second World War, a storm that spread across continents, reshaping empires and destabilizing governments. In this shifting world, Cambodia was not an isolated land. It was a small but significant piece in the wider geopolitical chessboard, caught between imperial ambition and local aspirations for self-determination. When Japan expanded its military reach across Southeast Asia, French Indochina became a target. In 1940, Japanese forces entered the region, forcing the French administration into a reluctant cooperation. In Cambodia, this uneasy arrangement meant that while French officials continued to operate, true control had slipped away. Japanese authority loomed over the land, its influence seen not just in the presence of soldiers but in the subtle tightening of political control. Life in the villages and towns was disrupted by the new realities of occupation. Supplies became scarce, and the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. The foreign rule was now twofold, and while the French still wore the symbols of authority, it was clear they no longer held the reins entirely. In March 1945, as the war's tide turned against Japan, the occupation authorities made a dramatic move. They declared Cambodia independent, removing French authority and presenting King Norodom Sihanouk as the head of a newly free nation. For a brief moment, there was hope, an intoxicating sense that centuries of foreign dominance might be ending. Streets filled with a cautious optimism, and conversations behind closed doors wondered what a truly sovereign Cambodia might achieve. Yet, even in this fleeting independence, there was a shadow of doubt. The Japanese move was not born purely of goodwill. It was a calculated strategy in the waning days of a war they were struggling to win. The dream was short-lived. By the end of the year, as Japan surrendered following the devastating events in the Pacific, the French returned with determined force. Their reoccupation of Cambodia was swift and decisive, extinguishing the flame of independence that had flickered so briefly. For many Cambodians, the return of the colonial power felt like a step backward into an all-too-familiar pattern of subjugation. Yet, the events of 1945 had planted seeds that would not easily be erased. The taste of self-rule, however brief, had awakened a generation to the possibility that foreign control was neither eternal nor unbreakable. For the young Saloth Sar, these years left an indelible mark. He had grown up in a society defined by the rigid hierarchies of colonialism, where opportunity was often tied to loyalty or connections, and where the rhythms of Cambodian life were dictated by powers beyond its borders. The war years, with their shifting rulers and sudden proclamations, revealed to him that authority could change hands quickly and dramatically. He would have seen the faces of elders in his village etched with both hope and fear, would have heard the quiet debates about loyalty and resistance, and would have noticed how quickly alliances could shift when survival demanded it. This was more than just a political lesson. It was an education in the fragility of power. The collapse of French dominance during the Japanese occupation, followed by their abrupt return, demonstrated that empires could falter, and when they did, there was space, however small, for new orders to rise. For a young man already learning to navigate the intersection of tradition and modernity, educated in both Buddhist and French Catholic institutions, these events formed a backdrop against which his own worldview was taking shape. In the years that followed, as Cambodia entered the turbulent post-war era, the memory of 1945 lingered. Independence would not come easily, but the precedent had been set. The people had seen a glimpse of it, however manipulated and temporary it may have been. For some, this was a source of quiet resilience. For others, it became a call to action. And for Saloth Sar, who would later be known to the world as Pol Pot, it was part of the formative environment that nurtured both his political ambition and his belief in the possibility of radical change. The shifting tides of the Second World War had revealed a truth that would echo throughout his life. the structures of power, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be dismantled sometimes in the blink of an eye. In 1949, an important turning point arrived in Saloth Sar's life. Cambodia was still under French colonial rule, its people restless beneath the surface. And the world beyond Southeast Asia was shifting in unpredictable ways. It was in this turbulent backdrop that Saloth Sar received a scholarship to study abroad, a rare opportunity reserved for the privileged few. For a young man who had struggled academically in his earlier years, this was both an unexpected gift and a direct result of his family's standing and connections. The destination was Paris, a city far removed from the rice paddies and dusty roads of rural Cambodia, yet one that was rapidly becoming a hotbed of political thought and revolutionary ideals. The journey itself must have felt like stepping into another world, a place where colonial subjects could, for the first time, see the imperial power from within and measure its contradictions up close. Paris in the late 1940s was not simply a center of art and romance, it was also a crucible of post-war politics. The devastation of World War II had shaken Europe's empires to their core. Anti-colonial movements were rising across Asia and Africa, inspired by the language of liberation and self-determination. In the cafes and student quarters of the French capital, intellectuals debated ideas that promised to reshape the world. Socialism, communism, nationalism, and new interpretations of democracy. For a young Cambodian student trying to find his place in history, these discussions offered both clarity and temptation. It was here that Saloth Sar first encountered the writings of Marx and Lenin, dense texts that spoke of class struggle, exploitation, and the vision of a society without oppression. It was not merely theory that drew him in, it was the people he met. Among the international students in Paris were other young men and women from colonized nations, each carrying stories of injustice, exploitation, and cultural pride. They shared in the belief that their countries deserved not just independence from foreign rule, but a complete restructuring of society. Saloth Sar found himself drawn to their passion, their certainty, and their conviction that history was on their side. In smoky basement rooms and over long nights of debate, he began to form bonds with those who would become his ideological comrades. Joining a small, secretive communist group marked a quiet but significant transformation. No longer was he simply a Cambodian student on foreign soil. He was now a participant in a global network of revolutionary thought. Meetings were discreet, the exchanges sometimes cautious, but beneath the secrecy there was a sense of urgency. Members studied political theory, analyzed the successes and failures of revolutions in Russia and China, and discussed how these lessons could be adapted to their own country's struggles. For Saloths, this was more than education, it was initiation into a way of seeing the world where change was not only possible, but inevitable if driven by the will of committed revolutionaries. Yet Paris was also a city of contradictions. While he absorbed the ideals of equality and liberation, he walked past grand buildings and boulevards that symbolized the very power structures he now questioned. The contrast between the wealth and order of the French capital and the poverty and instability back home deepened his sense that the colonial relationship was fundamentally unjust. The longer he stayed, the more he began to see Cambodia not as a passive subject of history, but as a nation waiting for its own awakening. This period in Paris would plant seeds that would later grow in complex and fateful directions. It was here that Saloth Sar learned to think strategically about ideology, organization, and the importance of secrecy in political movements. It was here that he saw how revolutionary change required not only ideas, but discipline and the willingness to work patiently for a long-term vision. And it was here that he began to imagine a future in which Cambodia would be transformed, not simply freed from colonial rule, but rebuilt from the ground up according to an entirely new set of principles. In the glow of Parisian street lamps, with political pamphlets tucked under his arm and the echoes of passionate debates still in his mind, Saloth Sar was quietly shaping the beliefs that would guide the rest of his life. What began as a scholarship opportunity had turned into an ideological apprenticeship, one that would carry him back across the seas with a vision for his country that was both radical and unyielding. When he returned to Cambodia in the mid-1950s, the world he stepped into was in flux. The nation had officially gained independence from France in 1953, but the young country was still navigating its identity, struggling to balance tradition with modern aspirations, and facing the quiet but growing tension between various political forces. Saloth Sar, who had spent years in Paris absorbing ideas that challenged the old order, found himself walking into a society where old hierarchies still held strong but where a restless undercurrent was beginning to stir. Taking up a job as a teacher at a private school in Phnom Penh, he lived a relatively modest life on the surface, but beneath that calm exterior, his worldview was steadily evolving. The classroom offered him more than just an income. It became a space to observe the younger generation, to see the hunger for change in their eyes, and to realize how education could be a tool not just for personal growth, but for reshaping an entire society. During these years, Cambodia's political climate was shifting in subtle but decisive ways. King Norodom Sihanouk, whose charisma and nationalist appeal had helped secure independence, was trying to maintain stability through a delicate balancing act, keeping Cambodia neutral amid Cold War rivalries, while also suppressing those he considered a threat to the unity of the nation. In this tense environment, voices calling for deeper reforms were often met with suspicion, and the political left began to operate more carefully, sometimes underground. Saloth Sar's involvement with left-wing politics deepened quietly. What he had studied in Paris, the works of Marx and Lenin, the principles of revolutionary change, the vision of a classless society, now seemed to him more relevant than ever. He began forming connections with individuals who shared his belief that Cambodia's path forward would require dismantling entrenched structures, redistributing power, and building a new social order from the ground up. But the journey from theory to action was neither quick nor simple. Saloth Sar navigated the political landscape cautiously, aware that open radicalism could lead to swift consequences. His approach was patient. He observed. He listened. He built trust within small circles. Even in his role as a teacher, subtle hints of his beliefs would sometimes emerge, cloaked in discussions about justice, fairness, and the dignity of labor. The modest man with a calm demeanor was not yet the leader he would one day become, but the foundations were quietly being laid. Every meeting in a dimly lit room, every whispered conversation with a trusted ally, every book or pamphlet passed from one set of hands to another, all were steps along a path that would eventually draw him into the heart of Cambodia's revolutionary movement. As the decade progressed, rural unrest began to grow. Many peasants, who formed the backbone of Cambodian society, felt that the promises of independence had not reached their villages. Land remained concentrated in the hands of a few, and the gap between urban elites and rural poor was stark. Saloth Sar, himself from a rural background, understood these frustrations deeply. He began to spend more time outside the capital, engaging with people in the countryside, listening to their grievances, and quietly reinforcing the belief that true change would not come from speeches in parliament, but from the mobilization of the masses. By the end of the 1950s, his path was becoming clearer. The quiet schoolteacher had already taken his first steps into the dangerous and complex world of underground politics, a path that would, in time, lead him far from the classroom and into the center of one of the most turbulent chapters in Cambodia's history. By the late 1960s, Saloth Sar, who would later be known to the world by a far more infamous name, had reached a turning point in his life and in the turbulent history of his homeland. The political atmosphere in Cambodia was growing increasingly unstable. shaped by a mix of internal unrest and the widening shadow of the Vietnam War that blurred across the country's borders. After years of teaching and quietly working to expand his network of like-minded activists, he now found himself under mounting pressure from government forces determined to root out communist influence. It was during this period, under the constant risk of arrest, that he chose to disappear from the public eye and retreat into the depths of Cambodia's remote jungle regions. This was not an isolated move, but a calculated step in a long-term plan to strengthen the revolutionary cause he had been building for over a decade. In the hidden camps of the Cambodian wilderness, Saloth Sa began forging new alliances that would shape the direction of the movement he was leading. The most significant of these connections was with the Viet Cong, the seasoned guerrilla fighters from neighboring Vietnam who were engaged in their own struggle against powerful adversaries. The Viet Cong not only offered military guidance, but also shared vital experience in organizing and sustaining an armed resistance under extreme conditions. In return, Saloth Sa provided something equally valuable: a network of Cambodian revolutionaries who knew the terrain, the people, and the political landscape of their own country intimately. This partnership was not merely one of convenience, it was built on shared ideological foundations, as both movements embraced Marxist-Leninist principles adapted to their local contexts. In the dense, humid forests, far from the cities and the watchful eyes of government security forces, the seeds of the Khmer Rouge began to take root. The jungle was unforgiving, its sweltering heat, thick vegetation, and the ever-present threat of disease tested the resilience of anyone who sought refuge there. Yet for Saloth Sa and his followers, the jungle offered not just safety but a space to experiment, to plan, and to shape the movement in their own image. Here, they trained recruits, refining guerrilla tactics inspired partly by the Viet Cong and partly by Cambodia's own history of resistance against foreign powers. Every step in these camps was aimed at building a disciplined and tightly controlled organization that could one day rival the authority of the government in Phnom Penh. The late 1960s were a time of chaos across Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, political divisions deepened, and the monarchy struggled to maintain stability as external conflicts began to spill over the border. For Saloth, these tensions were an opportunity. He understood that a movement like the Khmer Rouge could only thrive in times of uncertainty, when people's trust in traditional institutions was eroding. As he moved between jungle bases, meeting with cadres, and personally overseeing training, he projected an image of calm determination. His leadership style was deliberate, soft-spoken in private, but relentless in his strategic vision. Recruitment during this period expanded rapidly. Many of those who joined the movement were young, rural Cambodians who had little to lose and were drawn by promises of change, equality, and the chance to stand against what they saw as corrupt and oppressive governance. Saloth Sa's ability to speak to these aspirations, while keeping the long-term goals of the movement shrouded in a degree of secrecy, helped solidify his control. The jungle camps became more than just military outposts. They evolved into political schools where new recruits were taught the ideology of the revolution, alongside the skills of survival and combat. This phase of his life marked the true consolidation of the Khmer Rouge. While the movement's name was not yet widely known outside certain political circles, its influence was beginning to spread through Cambodia's countryside. Networks of sympathizers and informants carried news, supplies, and instructions between the camps and rural villages, slowly extending the reach of the organization. The collaboration with the Viet Cong brought not only weapons and tactical knowledge but also a sense of belonging to a wider revolutionary struggle across the region. By the close of the decade, Saloth Sa had transformed from a former teacher and intellectual into a hardened revolutionary leader with a growing army at his command. The jungle had reshaped him, instilling in him a belief that the destiny of Cambodia could be rewritten from its most remote corners. What began as a retreat for survival was now the staging ground for a movement that would soon step out of the shadows and onto the national stage, prepared to challenge the old order in ways the country had never experienced before. From 1970 to 1975, Cambodia was gripped by a storm that swept across its fields, forests, and cities, transforming the country in ways few could have imagined. The conflict that had simmered for years now exploded into full-scale war, drawing in outside powers and deepening divisions within the nation. In the chaos that followed the coup against Prince Norodom Sihanouk, the Khmer Rouge began their relentless push to expand their influence. Initially a force operating in remote rural areas, they steadily advanced, weaving themselves into the complex web of alliances and enmities created by the ongoing Vietnam War. The United States bombing campaign in the Cambodian countryside, aimed at disrupting North Vietnamese supply lines, had the unintended consequence of devastating villages, displacing thousands, and driving many into the arms of the insurgents. Each bombardment, each abandoned hamlet, seemed to swell the ranks of the Khmer Rouge with those who saw them as a path to resistance against both foreign interference and the Phnom Penh government. The cities, meanwhile, became islands in a sea of uncertainty. Phnom Penh, the capital, swelled with refugees who had fled the fighting in the countryside. Streets once bustling with commerce now echoed with the sounds of military convoys and the murmurs of families wondering when the war would reach their doorsteps. Food grew scarce, inflation soared, and trust in the government began to crumble. The Khmer Rouge capitalized on this desperation, presenting themselves not merely as rebels but as the voice of a new Cambodia, one that promised to cast off corruption. Foreign domination and inequality. In the remote provinces, they established tight control, enforcing strict discipline while using both persuasion and coercion to bring communities under their command. Their ranks, once small and scattered, grew into a formidable force, hardened by years in the jungle and battle-tested by constant skirmishes with government troops. By 1973, their control of the countryside was nearly complete. Government forces, supplied and advised by foreign allies, clung to the major cities. Supply routes and river crossings, but the rural heartland was largely in the hands of the insurgents. Supply lines to Phnom Penh grew more tenuous with each passing month, as Khmer Rouge units cut roads, destroyed bridges, and ambushed convoys. Even as the capital remained technically under government control, it was increasingly isolated, dependent on airlifts and river shipments for survival. Life inside the city took on a surreal quality: markets open in the morning, air raid sirens in the afternoon, and blackouts at night. The war was no longer something happening out there in the provinces. It was pressing at the city's gates. The leadership of the Khmer Rouge, working from their bases in the jungle and along the border, viewed the war as both a military and psychological struggle. Every victory was not just about capturing territory, it was about breaking the will of their opponents and demonstrating that their eventual triumph was inevitable. This sense of inevitability was reinforced in the minds of many Cambodians as the government faltered. Corruption scandals, military setbacks, and the constant strain of war eroded public confidence. The government's alliance with foreign powers, once seen as a lifeline, now fed into the insurgents' narrative of a ruling elite beholden to outside interests rather than the needs of the Cambodian people. In the final months leading to 1975, the noose tightened around Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge controlled almost all provincial capitals, leaving the central government isolated in the capital and a few outposts. Roads were cut, River traffic was intercepted, and food shortages grew dire. Diplomats, journalists, and aid workers reported an air of inevitability in the city, a feeling that the end was approaching, though no one could say exactly when. For the Khmer Rouge, these years had been a steady march toward their ultimate goal, each battle bringing them closer to the capital. Their fighters, hardened by years in the jungle and fueled by a vision of a radically transformed Cambodia, pressed on without hesitation. When viewed from the outside, it was a campaign marked by ruthless efficiency and unwavering momentum. Village by village, district by district, they encircled the heart of the nation, cutting off its lifelines and undermining its morale. By early 1975, Phnom Penh was a city under siege in all but name, dependent on dwindling supplies and holding out more through determination than realistic hope. The countryside belonged to the insurgents. The rivers and roads were theirs to command, and the capital was merely the last domino waiting to fall. This slow but steady encirclement was not just a military operation, it was the reshaping of Cambodia's political and social landscape. A transformation that would reach its climax in the months to come. The morning of April 17, 1975, began like no other in the Cambodian capital. Phnom Penh had been under siege for months, its streets filled with wary civilians, soldiers, and families clutching their remaining possessions, all waiting for the sound of gunfire to end. As the sun rose, the distant thud of artillery grew quiet, replaced by the rumble of trucks and the rhythmic march of boots. From the city's edge, columns of black-clad fighters entered in formation, their faces set with an unwavering determination. The war that had consumed Cambodia for years was over, or so it seemed, and the victors were the Khmer Rouge. Leading them from the shadows was a man few in the public truly knew by sight. Saloth Sar, better known by his revolutionary name, Pol Pot. For many, the moment was surreal. After years of bombings, famine, and political chaos, the arrival of a new power promised the possibility of stability. Even if few understood the vision that had driven these forces through years of guerrilla warfare. Children clung to their parents, watching the soldiers with a mix of curiosity and fear, while elders recalled other times in history when power had shifted overnight. The streets were quickly overtaken. Checkpoints established, and orders given swift, uncompromising, and absolute. It was on this day that Cambodia, in the eyes of its new rulers, ceased to be the Cambodia of old. The country was reborn under a new name. Democratic Kampuchea. Pol Pot's ascension was not accompanied by grand public ceremonies or fiery speeches. Instead, it was marked by an almost invisible transfer of authority, a quiet but total reorganization of the state. The city's leaders were removed, government offices abandoned, and entire ministries replaced with revolutionary committees. The transformation was immediate, reflecting the years of planning that had taken place deep within the jungle. For those who had followed Pol Pot from the beginning, this was not just a victory over the old regime, it was the first step toward building an entirely new society based on their vision of radical equality, self-reliance, and a return to what they believed was the pure essence of the Khmer identity. But the changes were not limited to the corridors of power. Within hours of the city's fall, orders swept through Phnom Penh that would alter the course of millions of lives. The streets, once crowded with vendors, bicycles, and chatter, became streams of moving people as residents were told to leave the capital and head into the countryside. Some were told it was temporary, that they would return in a few days. Others understood it as the beginning of a complete transformation. Families packed what they could carry, abandoning homes, shops, and hospitals. The air was thick with uncertainty. The faces in the crowd a mix of hope for peace and dread of the unknown. In those first days, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge leadership worked from the shadows, rarely showing themselves to the public. They preferred the symbolism of collective rule over the prominence of a single figure. But within the movement there was no doubt about who held ultimate authority. Pol Pot's years of preparation, his time spent studying revolutionary theory abroad, his alliance with the Viet Cong, his patient cultivation of loyalty among the Khmer Rouge ranks had all led to this moment. Now, with the old government dismantled, he had the freedom to implement his vision without compromise. From the outside, Cambodia's transformation might have seemed sudden. But for Pol Pot it was the fulfillment of a long and deliberate strategy. His movement had spent the early 1970s gaining territory village by village, spreading its influence, and building support among rural communities who felt neglected by the urban elite. By surrounding Phnom Penh and cutting it off from supplies, they had brought the city to its knees without launching a catastrophic final battle. The victory on April 17th was as much a psychological conquest as it was a military one. Yet, beneath the appearance of triumph, the seeds of an immense and far-reaching social experiment were being sown. The renaming of the country to Democratic Cambodia was more than a political gesture. It signaled the beginning of an ambitious and radical restructuring of every aspect of Cambodian life. The city would no longer be the center of power. In Pol Pot's new order, the countryside, the collective, and the agrarian ideal would take precedence over urban life, commerce, and traditional governance. In the days and weeks that followed, this new vision began to take form. The Khmer Rouge sought to erase not just the symbols of the old Cambodia, but also the very structures that had defined it for centuries. Money, private property, and social classes were declared obsolete. Families were separated, traditional institutions dismantled, and daily life reoriented toward communal work and rural self-sufficiency. For many, these changes were bewildering. For others, they were frightening. But for the Khmer Rouge leadership, this was the only path forward, a way to create what they believed would be a society free of inequality, corruption, and foreign interference. April 17, 1975, was the day the world's perception of Cambodia shifted, though few could have imagined the profound consequences that would follow. In the months and years ahead, the policies set in motion that day would reshape the nation's destiny in ways that remain etched in history. And at the center of it all stood Pol Pot, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a vision so sweeping that it would transform an entire country in just a few short years. In the days following their triumph in Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge wasted no time in setting their vision into motion. The city, still buzzing with confusion and relief after years of war, suddenly found itself gripped by a new and unyielding force. Soldiers, clad in black uniforms and armed not only with weapons but with a strict ideology, moved through the streets delivering orders that would change the lives of every man, woman, and child. The message was simple yet startling. Everyone was to leave the city immediately. The capital, once the beating heart of Cambodia, was to be emptied within days. Families gathered what they could carry, their possessions reduced to bundles and sacks. While questions hung heavy in the air, where were they going? And why? The answer lay in the leadership's vision for a radically transformed society, one that rejected the urban life, private ownership, and the concept of individual wealth in favor of a return to the soil. The roads leading out of Phnom Penh became rivers of humanity, stretching for miles under the searing sun. Elderly grandparents shuffled alongside young children, and patients were carried from hospital beds on stretchers made from bamboo poles. The exodus was not just from the capital. Across Cambodia, towns and smaller cities faced similar evacuations. These were not temporary relocations. They were the first steps in a grand social experiment and attempt to build a purely agrarian communist state. The leadership envisioned a society stripped of class divisions, where everyone would work the land and share equally in its fruits. To achieve this, money was abolished overnight, markets were closed, and possessions were deemed unnecessary luxuries. The new currency was labor, and the fields would become both workplace and home. Villages and collective farms began to take shape in the countryside. Families, often separated from one another during the evacuations, found themselves placed in new communities where personal ties meant little compared to loyalty to the collective. Here, the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the demands of the work. Dawn signaled the start of long hours in the rice paddies. Under the gaze of local cadre who ensured quotas were met, meals were taken communally, and food was rationed according to the needs of the group rather than the individual. Even the smallest aspects of daily life, what people wore, how they spoke, where they slept, were regulated in accordance with the new ideology. To the leaders, this was the path to purity and unity, a way to erase centuries of inequality and exploitation. They drew on historical grievances, framing their policies as a means of reclaiming Cambodia's soul from the influence of foreign powers and urban corruption. However, for those living through it, the transition was abrupt and disorienting. City dwellers unaccustomed to agricultural work found themselves struggling with the physical demands of farming. The absence of money meant that personal agency over one's livelihood was gone. All resources flowed through the collective system, leaving little room for individual choice. Despite the hardships, the regime's narrative remained consistent. They were building a utopia free from greed, crime, and division. Education was redefined, focusing not on books or scholarly debate, but on political indoctrination and practical farming skills. Religious practices were discouraged or banned entirely, replaced with revolutionary ceremonies that celebrated labor and loyalty to the state. The country's infrastructure shifted to support this vision. Roads were used to move supplies between collectives rather than to connect cities, and industry was limited to what could aid agricultural production. In the countryside, life settled into a new normal, though it was a reality far removed from what many had imagined. The Khmer Rouge's vision was ambitious and absolute, touching every aspect of life. Their experiment sought to turn back time to a pre-industrial age, but it did so with a rigid structure that left no space for dissent or deviation. Fields replaced markets, collective kitchens replaced home cooking, and the flow of coins and bills was replaced by the tally of labor done each day. By eliminating money and forcing the population into agricultural collectives, the leadership believed they were dismantling the roots of inequality and exploitation. Yet, this transformation demanded the sacrifice of personal freedoms, cultural traditions, and the very fabric of community life. It was a sweeping reimagining of the nation, one that would leave a lasting imprint on Cambodia's history, and it began with that unforgettable moment when the bustling streets of Phnom Penh fell silent, and its people were sent into the fields to forge a new future. The vision that Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge proclaimed was one of total transformation, a radical break from the past that would strip away what they saw as the corruption of cities, the influence of foreign powers, and the inequalities of class. But as this vision took shape, it carried with it a tide of suffering unlike anything Cambodia had ever seen. Across the nation, people were uprooted from the lives they had known. They were marched out of their homes and villages, away from the familiarity of bustling streets or quiet rural corners, and into an uncertain future dictated by the regime's relentless ideology. It was in this transformation that Cambodia would come to know one of the darkest chapters in its history, where the cost of reshaping society would be paid in human lives. In the rural fields, where the earth was tilled under the blazing sun, labor became both the tool and the test of the new Cambodia. Pol Pot's vision demanded that every citizen contribute to the collective farms, where food production was tightly controlled and personal choice was almost non-existent. For many, the labor was relentless, stretching from sunrise until nightfall, often with little to eat and no respite from the oppressive heat. The regime saw the countryside as the heart of the nation's rebirth. But for those who toiled there, it became a place of exhaustion, deprivation, and fear. The absence of money, markets, and traditional trade did not bring the equality promised. Instead, it dismantled the basic ways people had met their needs for generations. Families could not rely on old networks of barter or purchase. Everything was rationed according to the state's priorities. Food was scarce, and hunger spread quickly. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them vulnerable to illness. Medical care was limited, and many found themselves with nowhere to turn when sickness came. The ideals that had been painted in bold strokes were now etched in the harsh reality of daily survival. The harshest face of this period came to be known worldwide as the Killing Fields, a name that has since become synonymous with mass tragedy. These were not places marked by history before 1975. They were ordinary patches of Cambodian soil that, over time, became burial grounds for countless victims. Some were people accused of disloyalty or sabotage. Others targeted simply for their background, education, or perceived threat to the regime. In the eyes of the leadership, the purity of the revolution justified any measure, no matter how severe. But for the people living through it, the reality was one of constant vigilance, knowing that suspicion could be fatal. The loss of life was staggering. Estimates range between 1.7 and 2 million people in just a few years. This toll came not only from executions, but also from the grinding effects of overwork, persistent hunger, and the spread of disease. Entire families vanished. Villages were left empty. The silence in these places told a story as loud as any words, a silence born from absence, from voices cut short, from lives interrupted. Generations of Cambodians would grow up in the shadow of this loss, their personal histories intertwined with the larger national tragedy. Yet, even amid this darkness, there were stories of quiet resistance and human resilience. Some found ways to share scraps of food, to hide forbidden keepsakes, to whisper words of comfort when speaking them aloud was dangerous. The bonds of community, though tested, were not entirely broken. These small acts of defiance did not overturn the system, but they kept alive a sense of humanity that the regime sought to erase. In later years, as survivors began to tell their stories, the world learned the depth of what had happened in Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. The Killing Fields were no longer just a name. They became a symbol of the cost of extremism, a reminder of how quickly ideals can twist into instruments of destruction when they are enforced without compassion or restraint. Testimonies from that era speak not only of the suffering, but also of the endurance of those who lived through it, carrying forward memories that demand to be heard. What began as a revolution to create a new kind of society ultimately left scars that would take generations to heal. The Cambodian landscape, dotted with memorials and mass graves, is a testament to the past, but also to the resilience of a people determined to rebuild. In remembering these events, history serves not only as a record but as a warning, urging future generations to guard against the forces that can turn dreams into nightmares. And so, the story of Cambodia under Pol Pot remains a chapter the world must never forget, a story of ambition turned to devastation, of voices silenced but not erased, of a people whose strength endures beyond the tragedy they endured. By the late 1970s, the situation in Cambodia had reached a breaking point. The Khmer Rouge's radical policies had left the nation weakened and deeply scarred, its people suffering under the immense weight of famine, exhaustion, and fear. Along its eastern border, tensions with neighboring Vietnam had been steadily building. Skirmishes, border raids, and mutual distrust escalated into a dangerous standoff. For Vietnam, these confrontations were not only acts of aggression, but also a direct threat to their sovereignty. By late 1978, the conflict could no longer be contained through limited clashes. The Vietnamese leadership made the momentous decision to launch a full-scale invasion, a move that would alter the course of Cambodian history. In December of that year, Vietnamese forces crossed into Cambodia with decisive force. Their advance was swift, backed by superior organization and combat experience gained from decades of war. For many Cambodians, the sight of Vietnamese troops entering their villages brought a mix of emotions: fear of yet another foreign army, but also hope that the nightmare of the past years might finally end. Within weeks, the Khmer Rouge stronghold in Phnom Penh collapsed. In January 1979, Pol Pot and his top leadership fled westward, abandoning the capital and retreating toward the dense jungles near the Thai border. The regime that had reshaped Cambodia in such an extreme and brutal way was suddenly no longer in power, though its shadow remained heavy over the land. But this was not the end of Pol Pot's story, nor that of the Khmer Rouge. Stripped of their control over the government but still driven by unwavering ideology, they transformed into a guerrilla movement. In the remote border regions, they rebuilt their forces, drawing on both loyal fighters and the complex geopolitics of the Cold War. The Thai border became their lifeline, a place where they could find shelter and access to supplies. International politics, particularly the rivalry between major powers, meant that the Khmer Rouge was not entirely isolated. Aid and support, whether direct or indirect, flowed from various channels, allowing them to maintain their struggle despite being ousted from the capital. For the people of Cambodia, however, the change of power was far from an immediate return to peace. The country was devastated, fields lay abandoned, infrastructure was in ruins, and millions of lives had been disrupted or destroyed. The Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a nation from the ashes while still fending off persistent guerrilla attacks from Pol Pot's forces. Fighting in the border regions dragged on year after year, with ambushes, landmines, and hit-and-run raids becoming part of the landscape. Villagers in these contested areas often found themselves trapped between two sides, both claiming to fight for the future of Cambodia, yet both bringing danger to their daily lives. Pol Pot himself remained an elusive figure during this time, rarely appearing in public. He commanded his movement from hidden jungle bases, issuing orders and maintaining the dream of one day regaining power. His charisma still held sway over his followers, who saw their struggle as a continuation of a revolutionary mission rather than a lost cause. For them, the Vietnamese presence in Cambodia was an occupation, and the fight against it was a patriotic duty. Yet outside their ranks, the memories of the years under Khmer Rouge rule had left deep wounds, and many Cambodians could not imagine returning to that way of life. The international stage added another layer of complexity. The Cold War rivalry meant that some nations viewed the Vietnamese-backed government with suspicion, aligning their policies in ways that indirectly benefited the Khmer Rouge. Refugee camps along the Thai border became both humanitarian necessities and political tools, as fighters often mingled with civilians, blurring the lines between military and non-military zones. Meanwhile, the slow-moving diplomatic efforts to resolve Cambodia's crisis struggled to gain momentum, with decades passing before a full political settlement could be reached. Through it all, Pol Pot remained a symbol both for his followers, who still clung to his vision, and for the world, as a reminder of the extremes to which ideology and unchecked power could drive a leader. The jungles along the Thai-Cambodian border became his stage, the guerrilla war his enduring act, and the hope of reclaiming Phnom Penh his unyielding motivation. Yet the Cambodia he had once ruled was changing, scarred but moving forward, with new generations growing up in a world shaped by the events he had set in motion. It would be many years before the fighting finally ended, and by then, Pol Pot's influence had faded. His name remembered as part of one of the most harrowing chapters in modern history. The invasion of 1978 had marked the turning point, the moment when his grip on Cambodia was broken, but his story did not end there. From exile, from the shadows, he continued to shape events, leaving a legacy that would haunt the region for decades to come. As the 20th century neared its close, the chapter on Pol Pot's life came to an abrupt and murky end. In 1998, deep in the jungle along the Thai border, the man who had once ruled Cambodia with an iron grip died under circumstances that remain the subject of speculation. Some claimed it was heart failure, others whispered of suicide, while a few suspected foul play within his own fractured ranks. What was certain was that he left behind a nation still scarred, its cities, its countryside, and its people carrying the deep wounds of a genocide that had claimed the lives of nearly a quarter of its population. Even in death, his legacy continued to haunt Cambodia. The killing fields, once hidden under the guise of ideology, had become stark memorials, where the silence of the earth spoke louder than any courtroom testimony. Survivors lived with memories they could not erase, families torn apart, entire communities wiped from the map, and traditions interrupted for a generation. The countryside bore the skeletal remains of abandoned collective farms, while urban centers struggled to rebuild both their infrastructure and their soul. The pain of loss was matched only by the resilience of those determined to see their country rise again. Over the years, Cambodia slowly began the painstaking process of healing. The trials of former Khmer Rouge leaders, though delayed, brought some measure of justice and acknowledgement of the truth. Temples were restored, markets reopened, and the laughter of children began to return to the streets. Yet, no reconstruction could fully erase the shadow of those years. And perhaps it never should, because remembering is the only way to ensure such darkness is never repeated. Pol Pot's death closed a personal story, but did not close the book on the suffering he had unleashed. His vision of an agrarian utopia had collapsed into a nightmare, and the world remembered him not for building anything of lasting value, but for tearing apart one of Southeast Asia's most vibrant cultures. The tragedy of Cambodia under his rule remains one of history's starkest reminders that unchecked power, when paired with extreme ideology, can destroy even the most resilient of nations. As we reflect on this chapter, it is important to remember the survivors not as mere statistics, but as living proof that even in the aftermath of unimaginable horror, the human spirit can endure. Their courage, their voices, and their memories are the true inheritance of Cambodia, far outlasting the man who sought to erase them. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the darkest and most important lessons of modern history. If you found this story meaningful, please give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future stories like this. Your support helps keep history alive, and together we can ensure that the voices of the past continue to be heard. And now, wherever you are in the world, I wish you a peaceful night. May your dreams be filled with hope, your heart with compassion, and may you rest knowing that even the deepest wounds can heal when we choose to remember, to learn, and to care for one another. Good night.